Oh, awesome. So glad you could be here.
Did I say we're from Wahiwa?
Deanna?
Hi, I'm Deanna Espinas from Kiolomana United Methodist Church, and I think it's time for me to learn our history. And I wanted to say hello to Lois Takata, who was our Christian Education Director at Kololo Methodist Church. Hi, Lois.
Oh, nice. We see our connection at work, definitely in this class. Wow, we just went through like a full circle. Well, my full circle as I'm looking at you guys on my screen. And that was really quick, so that's awesome. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. And we are on our second week of the class. Oh, I got to fix the date. So we're in the second week. We're going to be going over 3 different sections. So it's kind of, I don't know, I think this class might be a little drier than last week's class. That might be because it's just a lot of different things, a lot of different details that go into how John Wesley's ministry really took off, and his journey of faith, which is a really important aspect of the Methodist history. So we're going to be going over the start of his ministry in Oxford and the Holy Club, which is how pretty much the Methodist movement started. And then his journey to the Americas, where he goes to Georgia. And then he has an experience of assurance of salvation, which is really important. And then as he comes back to England, there's a revival and everything starts to form. But he goes through a distinct theological journey as well, which is really important for the history of Methodism and how our theology in some ways differs from Reformed theology. So his theological journey really is like a river. It goes through the entire history, almost the entire history of how the Methodist Church starts. So that's what we're going to be going over. And then next week will be the start of American Methodism and the conflict and growth in American Methodism. And lastly, we'll do review. And I'm hoping we get everything. I think we might be reserving the last week for some things we might have missed. These are the resources. So John Wesley, he starts at Oxford. So he's, very educated. He majors in philosophy. He becomes a fellow at Lincoln College, which is one of the prestigious colleges in Oxford. And his parents are very, encouraging. So he graduates and he's on track for ordination. And then his dad wants him to come back to Epworth because his dad is a rector at Epworth and he really would like him to be his assistant. So he comes back for a period of time. But while this is happening, his younger brother, Charles, is still at Oxford. So his younger brother is really wanting to grow more spiritually, really wanting to see how he could grow in his faith. And then later on, John gets advice, or he gets an offer to become a lecturer at Oxford. So what ends up happening is he goes, because he wasn't getting paid much as a rector an associate at Epworth. So he goes back to Oxford and he's a lecturer. He teaches Greek and he has his own students and he's able to support himself. Well, while this is happening, he starts his theological journey. And one of the main things that he really struggles with, as he's teaching at Oxford, as he continually is analyzing his spiritual state, is he struggles with this idea of via media, which is the state of the Church of England. And what the Church of England wants to do, especially in the 1700s, after all the wars of the 1600s, they want to go in the middle way. And the theological viewpoint of the Church of England is a combination between Reformed theology, which is Lutheran and Calvinist traditions, and then the Catholic Church, which really focused on church tradition and works. So it's like 2 different things. So he is really trying to figure out where, what's more important, how do I understand my faith in between these two traditions? So he starts grappling with this tension while he's at Oxford. So as this is happening, Charles Wesley invites him to join this group of students that are really interested in holy living and holy, theological conversations, and kind of right up John's alley, because that's what he was struggling with and what he was thinking about. So it just starts off with people meeting regularly, just a group of people, and they just kind of talk and talk about theology, talk about their spiritual state. But there are a few people, especially this person, William Morgan, who's really involved in the community. And one of the things that William does is he encourages the group to go out into the world. So one of the things that he introduces them to is prison ministry. So, back then, I mean, right now we know that, prison ministry is something widely done, and it's, a major, it's something that a lot of churches are involved with. But at the time in the early 1700s, it was kind of strange, and it wasn't common practice. And some people really thought that if you were to go to the prisons, you were, if you were to spend time with the prisoners, you're kind of condoning this behavior. And the prisoners are there for a reason. So it was kind of unusual, but this group of students, they made that effort. They would go to the, prisons, they would talk to the inmates, they would come bringing books and food. And as you'll see later on, like sometimes you can't get into the prisons, right? So prisoners would drop down baskets from the windows, and the students would put in food and books and different things like that. So they started to do that, and they started visiting orphanages, they started tutoring kids, they started visiting the elderly and going to hospitals. So and all of this wasn't spontaneous. They weren't like, okay, today let's do this, another day let's do that. Everything was organized and regimented. There was a strict schedule. This is a picture in one of the Methodist books I was reading, the Heights Raider book, which is one of the main books I'm using. But this is called the Castle Prison. As you could see, it kind of looks like a castle. But in this picture, you kind of see this pole, right? I don't know if you could see it, but that's the basket where people would bring out. So this is the first prison that they really started to visit. They would drop down this basket, and the students would put food and books and things
Right.
inside them. So, so they started doing this, on a schedule. If we look at this quote, they, you know, within within all these ministries, they started to set up a time to do each one, and they would go and so here it says like Monday Picardo, which is a prison, Tuesday Castle, which is another prison, Wednesday Children, Thursday Castle. So every day they're doing something, every day is set aside for a particular kind of ministry. And they started to draw a lot of negative attention to themselves. Because as you can imagine, it's early 1700s in Oxford. Everybody is well versed in theology, probably a lot more reformed bent, and kind of thought it was kind of religious fanaticism, maybe legalism. Why are they doing all these things? And they started to develop a reputation as the Holy Club. And we call it the Holy Club because that's what we know it as. But it was a kind of an insult and a jab at this group of people. Like, oh, these kids, they think they're so holy. They're doing this and they're doing that. They would wake up early in the morning to pray, 5 o'clock in the morning. They also would fast. So people thought that was really extreme. They would fast like 3 days a week. And they were very frugal, they were very modest in how they lived. So they just kind of seemed very extreme. And this all comes to a head when William Morgan, the main person that was encouraging the group to go out into the community, he was Irish. So he goes back home and he passes away. So this really starts this rumor throughout Oxford, and everybody is like, well, of course, the Holy Club killed him because, here he is, he's, fasting 3 days a week, and he's doing all these things, and he's visiting prisons and going to orphanages, and, the Holy Club, that's why he died. Well, Wesley, he responds and he writes this Morgan letter. And in this letter, he writes a letter to the dad, really explaining um, that they did not that they were not responsible for Morgan's death. But basically, and there were little details like people would say, "Oh, because you guys were fasting," but he would say like he wasn't fasting for a while, a couple years, before he died. So it wasn't anything like that. And so he just like explains to the father, how that you know they were not responsible for his death. Obviously, he was sympathetic and everything, but he explains this, and then he gives a sermon. He transcribes a sermon that he gave a few months later, and he sends this letter. This letter gets leaked out. And nobody knows exactly who published it and who circulated it, but this letter was included in a pamphlet called Oxford Methodists, and it was really meant to get people to stay away from this group. Um, so then John Wesley, kind of like John Wesley's style, he takes the lemons pelted at him and he turns it into lemonade. He embraces this term, Methodist, and he kind of equates it to Greek medics from the first century that believed in good health and good regimen. But basically, that's the first time this group gets associated with the term Methodists. And it was not meant to be a nice name. It was meant to be kind of like a name calling. But it doesn't sound like name calling, but you'd have to be familiar with name calling in the 17th, early 17th and 18th centuries. It was equated with like people who, thought that they could find a method to become close to God, find a way to become close to God. So they were kind of seen as, religious fanatics. They were kind of like the way you read the Tower of Babel and think, what are these people doing? Trying to, build a tower to God. So that was what was happening. And that's how this group really becomes associated with the term Methodists. So as this is happening, a little bit before all this, they get introduced to someone named John Clayton. And John Clayton is the son of a bookkeeper, and he was very into, he knew publishers, he knew a lot of books, and he was really involved with this society promoting Christian knowledge, which is a society in the Church of England that really focused on Armenian theology and really focused on organizing your theology so that your theology makes sense. So Samuel Wesley was really involved in this theology, in this society. And John Clayton was a part of this society. And he connects John Wesley to all these other, publishers and all these other people around the area that are really interested in holy conversations, in deep theological thoughts, and they kind of start another group. So the Holy Club pretty much disbands in 1732, but after that, through John Clayton in 1733 to 1734, more groups start spreading, and they're very similar in their format to the Holy Club. What's interesting is the Morgan letter that transcribes the sermon that John Wesley gave in 1733, explaining the mission of the Holy Club and what exactly they were doing. That letter really galvanizes people to want to join this group. So basically, before, the Holy Club was considered, these people are legalistic. They're trying to find, their way to God, thinking that they can do all these things, and they're holier than thou. But in this letter that John writes, he explains that that they were not doing these things out of legalism, but out of a desire to become closer to God. And one of the things that he says is, we ask each other deep spiritual questions. It's not about rules and laws. We ask each other, how we are doing spiritually, and we want to grow spiritually. That's the ultimate goal of this group. So as that's happening, more people start to join this group because they're like, I want to be a part of something like that. So it's not just so it's 8 schools, about 40 people started coming together, and they have this same thing, and then they start visiting, they keep visiting, orphanages, going to prisons, and visiting the elderly and the poor. They also start going to workhouses, and workhouses is something that is kind of distinct to that time, especially, and they were really on the rise at this point in England's history. Workhouses were places where people who couldn't, take care of themselves, they couldn't find work. They were kind of warehoused in these houses where they would work, but barely get paid anything. And it was almost like a punishment to being poor. Like if you find yourself in a situation where you couldn't shelter yourself or you couldn't feed yourself, you were warehoused in these workhouses, and they were in such terrible conditions that you almost tried everything you could to not become poor. And it was a real problem in society at the time. And one of the things that John Clayton did, was encourage these groups of people to visit workhouses. So they started doing that, and some groups of these people were really interested in doing more of the, going to the community, doing all that. Some people were more interested in, theological study and theological reading and theological discussion. And each group kind of had their interests. One thing that John Clayton really introduced to this group of people um, was this idea of organizing themselves, into smaller groups. So societies in general is something that was common in England, right? Is groups of people, maybe 50, 60 people that are interested in a particular subject, like the Society Promoting Christian Knowledge. But the way that they distinctly formed these groups into smaller groups becomes distinctly Methodist and Wesleyan. So here's a picture of workhouses. So this is kind of like in a pamphlet. This actually looks really nice and spacious, but a lot of them look like this. You're just kind of you look like, I don't know, chickens in a pen. I don't know, just really terrible conditions. But they were going out and they were actually visiting these workhouses, praying with people. They were in the community. So this is all happening, and these groups are, taking form. And something happens. Samuel Wesley passes away. So John and Charles Wesley's dad passes away. And for a while, he wanted to get John to take over his parish, but, John consistently declined. And then through this Society Promoting Christian Knowledge, he found a way, somebody in that group connected him and gave him an opportunity to visit Georgia. So he had this real desire to evangelize to the Native Americans. And, the colonies were forming, and there were obviously large groups of people there. And he had this idea that he was going to go and evangelize to these Native Americans. And he had this big dream. So he goes. And while he's on his way to Georgia, he to go to America from England, it would take anywhere between 3 weeks to 3 months, because you're pretty much sailing blind. You were at the mercy of whatever elements, whatever events would come your way. You had to be you had to be really fortunate to get there in a reasonable amount of time. And there's this one point where there was a large storm. The boats were very small, very unstable, and they are they think that they might sink, and their ship might be wrecked in the middle of the storm. And he notices the Englishmen were all scared. Obviously they're all incredibly scared, but the German Moravians, he noticed, are not scared, and they are singing hymns, and they're completely calm. And this is when he first really notices, he really starts to think about the state of his soul. This quote from the book, he says, um, Heizenreiter says he was afraid to die, he was unwilling to die, and he was ashamed to admit it. And he quotes, "How pure in heart must he be who would rejoice to appear before God at a moment's warning." Wesley's anxiety was compounded by his growing tendency to see his fear of death as a testimony to his lack of faith. So this is the first time where he really feels, examines himself and thinks that he really lacks faith. You know, these Moravians, they're calm, they're singing hymns. They could, at any moment, this ship might sink, and they're perfectly at ease. And he and all the Englishmen are scared, you know, scared to death. So he really starts to examine himself, and the Moravians make a real deep impression on him, and he thinks that there is definitely something he can learn from the Moravians. So as he's there, he tries to minister to the Native Americans, but evangelism is really difficult. You know, the Creek Nation, they are not receptive of him or his message. One of the reasons is because um, the chief, Tomochichi, he shares that his father was actually murdered because um, his father refused to be baptized. So if you can imagine, you know, different traders had come before them. The Spanish traders had come, English traders had come, and really gave a you know, terrible impression of Christians and the gospel. So they really were not interested in hearing about this. And I think John Wesley was a little bit arrogant in thinking he could just go and, you know, just say the message and they would gladly accept, because it was, you know, it was really hard. They would avoid him. They weren't interested in what he had to say, probably mostly because of the terrible experiences that they had with other people that tried to evangelize to them. So he kind of puts that on the back burner. But he is continues to this idea of organizing into societies and focusing on spiritual living. He tries to bring that to the colonies, right? And people are not interested. And as you can imagine, these are the American colonies. Everybody's very rough and kind of, you know, rough around the edges. And he's a high churchman, right? He's a Anglican priest. So he brings this high church kind of culture to the colonies, and people are not as receptive. But you do see that he's really gifted in languages, right? You know, he's like, okay, there's not enough German and French ministers. I guess I got to learn German and French. And it's not too long before he starts picking up the language and he starts being able to minister and preach in German and in French. And also, he starts a school. He starts teaching at a school in Savannah, and he becomes very into the school, and he's trying to organize these groups. And there are a few people that are really interested in what he has to say. One of them is a young woman named Sophie Hopke, and you know, he starts teaching her Greek and Latin, and her and one other woman and a few other people, you know, they develop like a small group, but they start to date and they start to, you know, supposedly develop feelings for one another. And John Wesley had thought he would never get married because he wanted to focus his life on ministry, but here he is. He's in the colonies, and he starts to develop these feelings and this relationship with this young woman. Well, it becomes, you know, I guess he says like he's not thinking about getting married and all this stuff, and then she abruptly gets married to someone else. He finds out about it after the fact, and he gets really upset, and you know, he's really fueled with jealousy. And one of the things that, you know, in the Church of England, when you are going to get married, you present yourself, you know, to the priest. There's all these different you know, protocols supposedly, you know, before you get married. But he noticed that the colonies, people would just get married, you know, without telling the church, without, you know, and he really felt like there's something wrong here. And then this woman that he liked, um, you know, was interested in, gets married to someone else without telling him, you know, the pastor. So it's like, you know, he uses, I guess, his problem with the way things are done with the colonies as an excuse to kind of get back at her. So they do communion on Sunday, and he refuses her communion because he's saying that, she did wrong by getting married, like this, and she's not in the right state to do communion. Well, her guardian was a grand magistrate, and they take him to court, and they throw the book at him, right? The list is very long. They charge him with hypocrisy, they charge him with lewdness, they charge him with all these different things. And then he has to publish his journals and his diaries to kind of combat all these accusations. And just before he is put on trial, he leaves and he runs back to England. So as you can imagine, he is um, really upset, and he feels really dejected as he goes back to England. And he feels really sad. And he, again, as he goes back to England, he's really still worried about the state of his soul. And he keeps thinking about the Moravians and how sure they were of the state of their soul and their salvation, and so sure of their faith. So he starts spending a lot of time with the English Moravians, and the main person is Peter Böhler. He's a Lutheran minister, and he's spending a lot of time with him. And Böhler really encourages him to seek after a spiritual experience. So for us, this is something that we can all say, this is like kind of common knowledge for us, but this is kind of a new idea for um, someone at that time to be a Christian and then have this spiritual experience. And then, as Peter Böhler is explaining these things, and as he himself is searching, Charles Wesley, his brother, says a little bit before, "Oh, I had a spiritual experience. I had an experience of assurance." And then he feels even worse. But so a few days later, after he hears this, he explains that he's at a society in Aldersgate Street, and I'll just read this. In the evening, I went very unwillingly to a society in Aldersgate Street, where one was reading Luther's preface to the Epistle to the Romans. About 9:15, while he was describing the change which God works in the heart through faith in Christ, I felt my heart strangely warmed. I felt I did trust in Christ alone for salvation, and an assurance was given me that he had taken away my sins, even mine, and he saved me from the law of sin and death. So this is where we get the phrase, "my heart was strangely warmed," and I think all Methodists are familiar with this phrase. And it's it's strange because we know everything that he is listening to in Luther's epistle to the Romans. He knows all of it. And even in his confession, "I felt I did trust Christ alone for salvation." He knew that already. By this point, he's an Anglican priest in the Church of England. He's highly educated. He's so well read. And if you read throughout his spiritual journey, there's no shortage of, Thomas à Kempis, just William Law, like all these different books that he ponders upon and all these different theologies. But it's a difference between him knowing this broad range of theology and him knowing everything that there is to know and being so incredibly educated. It's that difference between knowing and suddenly believing and feeling for yourself. And this is his uh, experience. And as you know, as I might have shared last week, the way that Wesley kind of organizes his theology, or organizes how we understand everything in our Christian life, it's, scripture, tradition, reason. And all of these three were common, especially in the society promoting Christian knowledge. But then he adds experience. And that's partly because this experience of him, this heart strangely warm experience, was so crucial and so important in his spiritual journey. So he has this major experience, and this is what he's been waiting for. This idea of, he was always struggling between, works and faith. And here in this experience, he's able to embrace embrace faith and embrace what God has done for him and that Christ died for him. But it doesn't end his quest for the state of his soul. It actually, in some ways, I think, really challenges him, because he starts to wonder, then what was I before this heart strangely warmed experience? If I needed this experience and now I really believe in what I know, what was I before? Was I a Christian or was I not a Christian? And, his brother and all of his friends would say, you were a Christian. They were like, give it up, man. They were just like frustrated. And it's funny when you read some of the dialogue. And even some of his mentors were like, well, if you weren't a Christian before then you were a hypocrite and you fooled us all. So and then he starts continuing to grapple. But I think it's in this process, from the heart strangely warmed experience to the continual uh, conflicts that he feels about his faith, that really brings out his convictions on theology and really lays out the foundations for Wesleyan theology. And I think that's why it's so important that he went through this period. Well, so he is still struggling with this, and he goes to Herrnhut in Germany that has this Moravian community, because at this point he really thinks the Moravians have the answers. They have it all set out. So he goes and he tries to, and he visits, and it's almost like a pilgrimage, and he's searching for answers. So he returns to England. Oh, wait, so okay, so then afterwards he returns to England, and he's still like wrestling with this. But there's a few things that the Moravians really helped him see, and one of the things was um, the Moravians the Moravians in Germany understood that there could be degrees of faith, right? Um, that assurance and faith were two distinct realities, and so he noticed that the German Moravians could say, you could be saved, but you can have the assurance much later. Whereas the English Moravians said, no, it's all at once, right? You become saved, you become a Christian, and you are also sinless and blameless, and they collapse the two as one. So he starts to get kind of wrestle with these two different theological positions. But as this is happening, he returns to England, and his friends that he left behind kept all these societies growing. And as more societies grow, a first large society is a Fetter Lane Society, and it becomes organized and it grows. And mind you, this is still part of the Church of England. And you can't really see from this picture, but they actually get a small building, and they're able to use that building to meet and to have meetings, and you start to see this organization. So after that, he starts going to Bristol, England, which is a small populated city, and George Whitfield, who was one of the major players in the revival in England and in America, um, he was actually involved in the Holy Club, not as involved, they weren't quite close, but after he returns and he continues to be involved in these societies, in 1739, George Whitfield encourages him to come to Bristol. So he does that, and then he notices that Whitfield, he'll go outside and he preaches. So he stands on a little mound and he'll preach to 30,000 people. So as this is happening, right, in the 1730s, England is really poised for a revival, and that's because of different things. There's a real, so in the early 1700s, people were very spiritually apathetic. They weren't interested in really taking ownership of their faith. But starting this period, people started getting really interested in having a spiritual experience and growing close to God. So he sees George Whitfield preaching to thousands of people, and he, as a high churchman, feels really conflicted. But then he says, "You know what? I'll do the same thing." And the famous line is, submitted to be more vile, right? To be just as vile, to preach out in the open. So he goes, and then they realize it's all these people that can't make it to church on Sunday, that can't afford the clothes and the right attire and to look that way to be proper at church. You know, you have coal miners, day laborers, people from everywhere coming in droves to hear the message, to hear the gospel. And it's very effective. So just in the first few months, they end up preaching to 47,500 people on average, about 3,000 per occasion. So he starts going and preaching to crowds, and then he goes to London and he does the same thing, you know, and it becomes clear that there's really a movement that's growing and building. So and George Whitfield actually is really more famous in this sense. You know, he's really preaching. He becomes one of the most, like, he's a celebrity, right? He becomes the most, you know, well-known person at the time, especially in America as well. He's very well known for his preaching, and he really is connected with Wesley. And as Wesley is forming these societies, George Whitfield is right next to him and really wanting to connect with him and grow. So it's this like dynamic duo that's happening, and as people are hungry and desiring for faith. So we see that John Wesley is really starting to see the fruits of his ministry. And, you know, here he is really desiring for holy living, really desiring for people to grow in their faith, much more so than just the average parish priest, right? He's really wanting to see people grow and accept and also have that spiritual experience, also have that assurance of salvation. Um, but as he's doing that and he's preaching, he sees the fruit and he sees everybody else. He sees people responding to that. And in a sense, because of this ministry, is he himself he's becoming more sure of his faith, and he's becoming more sure of where he is with God. And after this point where he kind of settles his theological journey, we see that he starts to have some conflict with some people in this society. So as this revival is growing, more and more people are coming. They start to organize their groups. So the larger groups are societies, maybe 50 or 60 people. Then because as they're growing, they need to collect funds. So one of the things that Wesley does is he groups people into classes. So classes are about 12 people, and it has to do with living in the same area, almost like small groups, right? Living in the same area. It doesn't have to be same age groups or gender. Um, and they would collect funds and meet together. Bands were about smaller groups of people, you know, 5 to 6, you know, 6 people, and those were divided by, you know, gender and age groups. So you had different ways that, you know, people were coming together and people were connecting and joining in their spiritual journey. And then one of the main societies that's formed is the Foundry, right? So they kind of end up merging some of these societies, and some of his friends, they find this building, and in that building they create a school. So this is a picture. So we really start seeing, you know, the movement grow. So in A over here, this is where Wesley was staying. B, his study, I guess, up here. And then C, we have the bell. D, the main entrance. And E, the preaching house. So this building was like kind of dilapidated, and they had to kind of raise funds to renovate it and to fix it. It was like almost like a dilapidated, you know, farmhouse kind of thing. But they now have this building and this place to meet, and it really starts to take form. Now, so as this movement is growing, we really start seeing, especially in the societies, the differences in theological views. So as these groups originally were forming, it was a combination of the Moravians, George Whitfield's group, and John Wesley's group and Charles Wesley's group. So it was a combination of different groups, but over time, John Wesley starts to break from the Whitfields and the Moravians theologically. And that's because of different reasons. One of the things is, when they're going out and they're preaching to thousands of people, right? They're both saying the same things, like Whitfield preaching and John Wesley preaching. They say, by God's grace, God's grace is available to you. God's grace is there for you. God loves you, right? They're all saying the same things. But when you start breaking up into societies and figuring out how to live out your faith, that's when the differences in theology really come about. You start seeing the differences in theology and the differences in the practice of ministry. So Whitfield is staunchly Reformed, and so are the Moravians. And John Wesley is Armenian. So this is kind of a, tale as old as time, a theological debate between Armenian theology and Reformed theology. And it differs in a lot of ways. John Wesley really believed in universal salvation. And that means he believed that God's grace is available for anyone and everyone, that God did not distinctly choose specific people and only those specific people are to be saved, but that God's grace and love is available to anyone that accepts and receives that gift. Calvinists, they believe the contrast of that could be summed up in the 5 points of Calvinism, and it's an acronym that we call TULIP. So T is total depravity, U is unconditional election, L is limited atonement, I is irresistible grace, and P is perseverance of the saints. Now, the U, L, I, and P are pretty much all saying the same thing. They're saying it pretty much means that God has predestined a group of people to be saved from the beginning of time, and if God has chosen you, you are elect, and your faith will persevere. You will not backslide. You will persevere, and that's that. And John Wesley really rejects this idea. And later on, you start seeing this conflict between him and Whitfield and the Moravians. They start publishing tracts and preaching sermons that are kind of against what the other one is saying. But you see that the reason why, especially why John Wesley is very firm in his belief in Armenian theology, because of the effects theology has on holy living and the practice of ministry. So he believes that unless somebody chooses to accept God's grace for themselves, and unless somebody makes that choice themselves, and unless they have a part to play in their role of faith, they're not going to be active in their faith. They're not going to practice holy living. They're not going to try to make a difference in the world. They're not going to, change the way anything is, because if you believe that God has chosen you and predestined you and will automatically, sanctify you, then you really don't have any part to play in it. And that's really the problem that John Wesley has. He's saying that the person has to accept it. And as the person is accepting it and the person is living into their faith, they become righteous because they are living into the promise of God. And that means they are trying to become close to God. They are seeking and searching God. They are living out in the world. They're doing good works. They're making a difference in the world around them. And that's why he's very firm on this understanding. He's very firm in his Armenian theology because of the implications on what it means for sanctification. So yeah. Okay. Stop share for a second. I should be an expert on Zoom right now. I have so many things open. Okay, there we go. So I just said a lot about a lot of things. And next week, we're going to go into just the growth of the revival, how these conflicts kind of play out. And then we're going to dive into American Methodism. So there's a lot of things happening. But let's break up into groups. And then I'm going to post up some questions. Okay. Let's see how this works. Last time I had to put them in the chat. Hold on. Okay. First off, are there any questions before we break up into groups? Atina?
Can you just quickly tell me what is Armenian theology? I'm sorry, I
Okay.
didn't get that in.
No. I should have, I should have explained more. So, Arminius was a theologian. I think it was in the 1600s. No, 1500s. And basically, Arminius believed that, just as John Wesley believed, that that the grace of God, the gift of salvation, is available for anyone who receives it. So during the Reformation, so, theology, whatever theology, is always a reaction of whatever is happening in society at the time. So, Reformed theology is really a reaction against the Catholic Church, and a church that was steeped in institutionalism and, buying indulgences in order to forgive sins, that end of the spectrum, which was the Catholic Church at the time. The Catholic Church today is very different. But Luther really wants to separate uh, believing in Christ from works. Because anytime you think that anytime you put the two together, according to Luther, you're trying to earn your salvation. So this came up, and then Calvin takes it the next step and says, you know what? God has preordained before the beginning of time who is going to believe in God and who isn't. So he creates a systematic theology around this belief. And the Anglican Church, to some extent, embraces some of that theology. But there's a wide range in the Anglican Church. There are a lot of people that believed in Armenian theology that no, God is not predestined in the beginning of time. Who believes in God and who doesn't. God leaves that choice to human beings, and um, we have the burden. We have to accept that gift for ourselves. So Calvinism and Armenian theology were very comfortable in the Anglican Church, because the Anglican Church, they were okay with this wide spectrum of theological beliefs. So, people that were in the society promoting Christian knowledge were embracing Armenian theology. And then you had a lot of people who were more Puritan, which is like very, Calvinistic in their theology. There was all different, theological spectrums, and pretty much the Church of England was like, let's just all get along. And we see with John Wesley, these differences really come out in ministry. It's kind of a long-winded answer. Um,